a wonderful event for us to address issues about Catalonia, Catalunya, and that wonderful region, and also Spain, of course. Both, many of us study, love, and to be faithful to both, to love and study. And we will remain that for many years, regardless of what happens tonight in our debate. Catalonia's independence, sense of identity, sense of nationalism, sense of autonomy, goes back a long time, 19th century, and evolves. We don't have time to rephrase all of that. And then we are now faced with a critical moment, perhaps the most intense in history, possibly. And then leading up to a vote, which is going to be December, Jordi, ¿cuándo?
December 21st?
December 21st, on the referendum, right?
No, it's an election.
Elections on what?
Regional elections.
The final vote on what? On deciding whether to...
The parliament. The Catalan parliament that's been dissolved.
But I'm sure this is only at the beginning, right? There'll be other chapters, and we're going to be staying with them and follow them. So please sign up if you give us your name. We intend to have, we would love to have at least one or two more meetings. It was an honor for the Billner Center, which I'm here representing this evening. Someone introduce Marianne, who's going to start the presentations. And then each speaker will go for 15 minutes, 15 minutos, 15. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So Marianne, you want to start?
Well, I'm very grateful to Antoni Pizà for having suggested to Mauricio Fon that I might be a good person for this lecture, and it's a privilege to be here. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a translator, but it could be argued that there are few people better equipped to discuss the intricacies of the stalemate Catalonia and Spain have reached than a translator who moves back and forth between cultures, behind the cultural lines, so to speak. There is always a certain amount of espionage involved in translation, if only listening in the background, and the interpretation of signs that might be less visible to others. Also, simply by virtue of having attained a certain age, I have accumulated a lifetime of observations that are also germane to the conversation. I traveled to Barcelona to act as an international visitor for the October 1st referendum. This is different from an observer. The observers were actually people from the world of institutions, but international visitors were people who were interested in the Catalan situation and wanted to be there for the votes. On reflection, I realized that this year, 2017, marks 40 years since I first lived in Barcelona. Not only that, in my intermittent stays in Barcelona over the years, I have been present for a number of different events that have been crucial in arriving at the present moment. In 1977, the first multitudinous demonstration demanding a Catalan Statute of Autonomy was celebrated in my lifetime. There were others in the 30s. The National Day of Catalonia celebrates the 1714 defeat of the Catalan cause during the War of Succession. Commemorates, of course, celebrate a defeat. And the imposition of the Bourbon king, Philip V, whose descendant is King Philip VI, the present-day king. The Catalan institutions, as a result of the loss, were prohibited. The universities were closed. And in 1977, the 1977 demonstration demanded the restoration of the Generalitat. It was an amazing year. They also celebrated the first gay rights demonstration. There were the anarchist days in the Pueblo Español. It was the absolutely incredible blossoming of democracy. The restoration of the Generalitat and the recuperation of the 1932 Statute of Autonomy of Catalonia was what was being demanded, as well as the freedom of the political prisoners and the return of President Tarradellas from exile. So there had been, in February of that year, there had been massive demonstrations and people were actually arrested. And so the slogan of the demonstration, of all of the demonstrations in those days, was Libertad, Amnistía, Statute de Autonomía, Liberty, Amnesty, and the Statute of Autonomy. This was my first experience of the grand social cohesion the Catalan society can marshal despite political opposition. I returned to Catalonia with a Fulbright to do my doctoral research in 1980-81. The transition seemed to be coming along, and I had been sought out by the American cultural attaché to help him support the state of the autonomies, to support Spain, the Spain of the autonomies, by establishing university exchange programs between Catalonia and the US. On February 23rd, 1981, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero burst into the Congress of Deputies in Madrid and attempted a coup d'etat. This is that picture. Early the following morning, King Juan Carlos, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was listening with a shortwave radio and to BBC because there was only music, military music on the Spanish stations. Early the following morning, King Juan Carlos announced that he would not support the coup, and things seemed to go back to normal. Nevertheless, supporting the state of the autonomies was no longer the official goal of the American government. When a month later, I foolishly and naively called the cultural attaché to try and pick up the thread of our conversations, he told me, "Oh no, Marianne, we can't support the Spain of the autonomies. Now we have to support Spanish democracy." This is simply an anecdote, but it goes some way toward explaining how far the involution of the establishment of the autonomies would go at that moment, that even something as small as that would come a cropper. Narcís Serra was the mayor of Barcelona at the time, and he was a very canny fella. So he invited the army to celebrate the Day of the Armed Forces in Barcelona, which was quite an unusual event. I was sitting having a cup of coffee on the Rambla, and I saw a tank come down the middle, and it was quite an astonishing experience, and helicopters flying overhead. It didn't feel like a celebration. But Narcís Serra seduced all of the wives of the generals by giving them roses, and he became sort of the golden boy for relations with the military. So Felipe González invited him to become the Minister of Defense. He went to Madrid, and Pascual Maragall became the mayor of Barcelona. So even though things were moving backwards, there was faith, and there were visionaries who wanted Spain to achieve its destiny as a... That's the day of the armed forces. And those articles are incredible. The kings in the exhibition of the Pedralbes, and thanks to a great extent to the armed forces, we are managing to bring about democracy, which was exactly the opposite. So there were visionaries who wanted Spain to achieve its destiny as a nation of nations, a plurinational society. In 1999, and 2003, I had the immense privilege of working on Pascual Maragall's campaign for the presidency of the Generalitat. He had been the mayor of Barcelona for 15 years and then ran for the presidency. In the midst of the campaign, I was standing backstage 20 feet away from then Prime Minister José Luis Zapatero when he looked down at Pascual Maragall in the audience, down in the sense that... and declared, "Pascual," and this was his gesture, "Pascual, I will support the reform of the Statute of Autonomy that the Parliament of Catalonia approves." This was a very important, and Zapatero. This was a very important moment and a very important statement. I wish I had had a cell phone at the time, because I would have had a great picture for next day. The Catalan Statute of Autonomy that was going to come out of the Parliament established for Catalonia the European principles of subsidiarity and devolution, which called for government functions always to be performed at the level closest to the citizen, and that central control by the state should be developed whenever possible, devolved rather, to the regions and cities that should exercise them. It was an exercise in federalism, in contrast with the 1979 Statute of Autonomy, which was limited to the definition of competencies. The state does this, the autonomy does that. This statute defined the responsibilities of the government to its citizens and the rights of the latter at every level. The statute was criticized from the right as a stealth reform of the Constitution, at a time when no one was thinking of reforming the Constitution. And from the left, it was seen as being too lukewarm, too establishment, too federalist. The new statute was approved by 91% of the Parliament of Catalonia, by the Cortes Generales, Cortes Generales, the Parliament of Spain, although in a curtailed form, so they cut back on the Statute of Autonomy that came out of the Parliament of Catalonia. And it was approved by the electors of Catalonia in a referendum, which voted 73, almost 74% in favor, on a turnout of 48%. Immediately upon its approval, 2 more autonomous regions applied it in their own jurisdictions, Valencia and Andalusia. In fact, Valencia has it written into its statute of autonomy that if anything happens in Catalonia, it will automatically be applied in Valencia. Ironically, the Catalan Statute of Autonomy has been subject to an objection of unconstitutionality by the Popular Party, but the Valencian one hasn't. This led to the first mass demonstration in 2010, led by Òmnium Cultural, which is the Catalan cultural organization that came up during Francoism. And it was under the direction of Muriel Casals, who was a retired professor of economics. The slogan of this demonstration was, "We are a nation, we decide." But I was not personally there, and I have not been over the successive years in which the September 11th demonstrations only continued to grow. I was not there for any of those. I was here in New York, establishing the Farragut Fund, translating Catalan literature and watching. But I was there on October 1st this year for the referendum as an international observer. And I was at the Institut Pau Claris, which is a high school attached to grammar school. But it was one of the places where there was a kind of a bulletin that went around to the international visitors and people who were taking part. And they said, this is a school that needs more observers. It needs more people. Because at 6 o'clock in the morning, the Mossos, the Catalan autonomous police, were going to go and if there weren't enough people, they would close the polling station down. Yeah. So if there were enough, the Mossos would make a report and leave. So there were enough of us there. There were about a dozen Basque firemen. There were teachers from Mallorca, and it was a very festive occasion. The people had been sleeping all night in the polling station to protect it. Then there was this infusion of people, and I mean, they were singing children's songs. I mean, it was quite lovely. So at a certain point, they opened the woman came with the ballot box.
I'm not sure, but
Okay.
it's okay.
Okay, I'm almost, this will be exactly 2 minutes. The woman came with the ballot box. We formed a corridor so that she could come into the polling station, and they started the vote. So after about an hour and a half, around 9:30, it started at, no, I'm sorry. The voting started at 9, it was about 9:45. They started saying, oh, the police are coming, but they didn't at first. And at a certain point, the police actually arrived, the Spanish police dressed in anti-riot clothing. And this is what we saw. Got the idea. Just a conclusion. I think this was done with the intention of frightening people into not voting, but in the afternoon, I went to another polling station. There were people who hadn't intended to vote who did go to vote. But I think it's interesting the point of my going through my life history is that I was very much in favor of federalism. I was completely on board with the Statute of Autonomy. And if I've become an independentist, it's to a great extent because I don't see the future for federalism at this time. And this is also said from the point of view of the United States, which is a country that has also become too big to fail. And so I think the hopefulness of being able to have a government that will be always working for you at the level closest to the citizen is something that we can all aspire to. Thank you.
Well, Marianne, thank you so much for your talk. As usual, very enlightening. Thank you so much to Mauricio Font for inviting us to be part of this panel, and also the staff of the Bildner Center, Elba and Rosalina, who have put this event together. So thank you. So there is some coffee, there are some drinks in the, well, not real drinks, but some water and coffee in the back. So thank you to the Bildner Center for organizing this event. Like in all difficult situations, there are so many nuances in any type of complex issue. With the Catalan independence movement, one of these nuances is what happens to the peripheral areas of the Catalan-speaking world, and more specifically the Balearic Isles, Mallorca, Menorca, Ibiza, etc., etc. Now, I come from Mallorca, so I know from my own experience. But I've lived 25 years in New York, so I eat Chinese food and I read Catalan poetry at the same time. So, in New York we belong nowhere, but we belong everywhere. So my view is a little bit from a distance, from the periphery. I think that this periphery is expressed in many different ways. I'm not a politician, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm a musicologist. I've never been political myself. So at the same time, living all these years in New York, it has created a certain distance for any issue related to Spain. And coming from Mallorca, coming from the Balearic Isles, I also see this movement of independence in Catalonia with a certain distance. The working title of my brief talk is, would the Balearic Isles ever join an independent Catalonia? Okay, this of course is a rhetorical question. I can give you the answer right now, what I think the answer is, and the answer is no. So I'm going to qualify my answer. Now, the Balearic Isles, specifically, when I say the Balearic Isles, I will mostly speak about Mallorca, which is the largest island. The Balearic Isles is a Catalan-speaking area. 87% of the population speak Catalan as a native language, and they use it all the time. There is more use of the Catalan language in Mallorca than in Catalonia per se. So that, I think, is very important. And when Marianne was describing the coming of democracy in Spain, and I was very young, but I do remember, to call the language that we spoke, to call it Catalan, was already, and again, I was in 1977, I was very young, but concerned a little bit about these things. But to call it Catalan was already, and to be able to call it Catalan officially in the official documents, it was a fight. It was a very, very difficult fight. In Formentera, small island also in the Balearic Isles, if 30 or 40 years ago you would have asked them, what language do you speak when you don't speak Spanish? They would have told you, pagès. In other words, peasant language. So to call Catalan Catalan was already again in the dignity towards our own language. And that, I think, it's a very small detail, but it's also an important detail. The Balearic Isles with Catalonia, they share a history. In the 13th century, a Christian Catalan crusade invaded Mallorca and expelled, killed, and basically eradicated 300 years of Muslim rule. Before the Muslims, there had been Romans, there had been all kinds of culture. But since the 13th century until now, there has been in the Balearic Isles the idea that there is a macro structure or a kind of an invisible structure of unity and affinity with Catalonia. Now, that unity and that affinity does not always translate into votes. Right now, in the Balearic Isles is one of the 17 so-called autonomous regions of Spain. Catalonia is one, Galicia is another one, Andalusia is another one, the Balearic Isles is one of them. So right now the government is a center-left government, but that is an absolute anomaly. The Balearic Isles, since the beginning of democracy, has always voted for the Conservative Party, the same party that ordered these police to attack people during the vote. But there are so many nuances. Before the center-left government, there was the normal government that has governed the Balearic Isles basically for 30 or 40 years, the Popular Party, so-called Popular Party. And this party, 4 years ago, took a very open and very overt anti-Catalan slant. In the Balearic Isles, there are two popular parties. There is the Popular Party, which is regionalist. In other words, speak your own language, dance your own dances, make your own foods on your holidays, but as long as we can do our business. Business in the Balearic Isles is huge. People think that the economy of the Balearic Isles is tourism. It's not. The economy of the Balearic Isles is construction, and the sale of real estate. That's the largest financial sector of the Balearic Isles. Tourism is also there, but it's construction. So the Conservative Party, the regional sector of the Conservative Party, as long as they can do the real estate business, they're happy with people being happy speaking Catalan and calling Catalan Catalan. But 4 years ago, a sector very much anti-Catalan of the Balearic Isles won the election, and the voters punished them when the next election, which was 2 years ago, came back. So it is clear that most, or at least it is clear to me, of course, everything is open for discussion and argument, but it is clear to me that most people in the Balearic Isles, they feel and they acknowledge a certain relationship with Catalonia, but that this relationship does not translate into votes for what some political parties have said, a political union with Catalonia once and if, of course, if Catalonia becomes independent. So that's my basic point. There is this cultural affinity, but that affinity, you could go one by one and ask each voter, so the voters are divided. Not divided, it's mostly, in my view, at least for what I've seen as an observer, is basically there is not enough votes. So to answer my rhetorical question at the beginning of my talk, if there was an independent Catalonia, would the Balearic Isles and maybe other regions that they also speak Catalan, southern France, Valencia, etc., etc. So would they ever think of joining this possible Catalan Republic and independent republic? And I think the answer is no. I think the answer is no. I want to add also that, again, opinion. This is my opinion, we all have our opinions. I think that right now, the independence of Catalonia would be bad for the Balearic Isles. And this is the reason. The reason is that once Catalonia is independent, the only Catalan-speaking people, truly, really speaking people in Spain, in the Kingdom of Spain, would be the people in the Balearic Isles. So we, although I have been living here for 25 years, I still say we would become orphans our big brother or big sister, which is Catalonia, Barcelona, etc., would be gone. So when it comes the time to go to create a curriculum for the schools and say, okay, how many hours of Catalan language do we want to have? If we don't have Catalonia to support us, Madrid probably would say, let's learn English and German, much more useful than Catalan, So, and then they would eradicate the Catalan language from the Balearic Isles. This is my view. Again, this is an opinion. I'm sure that we have in our panel, a lot of people who have studied this. I have not studied any of this. I'm just mentioning my own observations and basically opinions. So everything is open to discussion. And I hope that we discuss this once the panelists are through with their own presentation. So thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. The title of my presentation is The Future of the Pro-Independence Movement in Catalonia. But before I begin boring you, a personal note. I'm in shock. I think we all Catalans are in shock, and it's good that we acknowledge this. One thing is to know something, and I'm working, my research is on self-determination, so one thing is to know something, and another thing is to live something, or experience something. So I have friends in jail now, and I have friends in exile now, and I'm in shock. So what I'm going to try to tell you today is my own attempt at overcoming fear. I hate when in movies, these characters appear that they always have sad stories. In American movies, they're like these secondary characters that end up always dead first. So, I don't like being this character. But fear is real. I always say that I've experienced the three most fearful moments of my life are the day I lost my parents, the day I had my daughter, and the day 5 police officers were kicking me on the floor. So, now that I've expelled the demons. Let me begin with some facts. Regardless of what you think of this situation, this is here to stay. In some form or another. This is not going anywhere. During those days, I had an interview with the BBC, and they asked me, can you tell us a little bit of the history of this conflict? And I answered, can you pick a century? And then I'll explain that century, because, otherwise... And they said 13, and I said, okay, sit down. The cost of suppressing the Catalan movement, it's not at low cost. It's a very high cost for Spain. This time around, it includes the violation of fundamental political rights. And this is not only this is outrageous, but you can even claim that this is something illegal according to Spanish law, and then you can get into some details about it. But many other things were done before. Websites were shut down. This is, in itself, we give these things for granted. People were walking down the street with political propaganda under their arms, and they were stopped by the police. Those leaflets were confiscated, their names were written down. Police showed up in newsrooms and identified journalists. These things, this is not minor, it has a cost. Not only for the activist itself, or the journalist itself, or the citizen itself. It has a cost for democracy itself in Spain. You cannot overcome this easily. It has costs. And also, maybe the highest cost that nobody's speaking about is the deep psychological breakup that has happened between Catalans or at least some Catalans, or many Catalans. and the rest of Spain. On October 1st, after everything had happened and I had gone to the hospital and everything, we went to vote finally. And I took my sisters and my nephews and nieces. And we went to a school where we knew that the police was not going there, because I had gone there before and checked that everything was right. There were thousands of people, so it was safe. And we went there, and my nephews, they had a panic attack. And we had to go home, leave them home, and then go back and vote, right? This is a psychological breakup. This is something that will not be solved by, just some, sweeping things under the rug or ignoring the problem. This problem is here to stay. And this has consequences. Economically, for sure, Catalonia is a powerhouse in Spain. It always has been, because as you know, economics is a function of three things: institutions, natural conditions, and war, right? Where there's war, there's no good progress. Where there are good natural conditions, Barcelona and Catalonia, they have natural conditions, excellent natural conditions for economic development. That explains why it is a powerhouse and always has been. And it also, institutionally, when institutions have worked in favor of that economic progress, there have been a blossoming of economic progress. When institutions have worked against that, then there's decadence. So this will have a cost economically, and a cost for Spain, which is an economy with a lot of problems. Some of them are somehow ignored by the international community because the European Central Bank is doing their job at trying to control this crisis in the south of Europe. But it will have problems, and probably starting next year we're going to see some consequences. But on the long run, for sure. Then politically, I think probably is the worst consequence. Because there was a dream, there was a discourse that Spain could be this cosmopolitan place, right? We've seen this in movies, in literature, we've seen this in many cultural instances. And the discourse, the narrative that Spain was offering to their minorities was the discourse and narrative of cosmopolitanism. Actually, they're looking down on some of these minorities was, we are the cosmopolitan and you are parochial, right? This was like the kind of clash, cultural clash. But now this is over in Catalonia, because the discourse is only law and police. You cannot do this because it's against the law. There's no other argument. It's against the law. And if you disobey that, there's the police backing this up, right? So politically, this is very complicated because you cannot build anything around these two principles, law and police. And finally, culturally, what can the Spanish culture offer to Catalans as a springboard for creation? What exactly? Because all the incentives that now are put in place say fall in line. These are the incentives. There are no incentives to say challenge the rule, challenge the establishment, challenge conventions, be critical of whatever is given to you. This is part of the culture that's being suppressed symbolically and literally. This might not be catastrophic, right? This is not the 1930s, so this might not be catastrophic, but for sure it opens up a period of decadence. And I think we should be aware of this, because we're all part, we meaning all Spaniards, whether they're Catalan or not, we're part of this. Now, one said this, what is the future of the pro-independence movement? First of all, I want to say something. I'm very critical of our leadership. I'm very critical of our government and social leadership. I think what they have done is a great irresponsibility. I'm pro-independence. I'm very well known for being pro-independence, even radical pro-independence. I'm the bad, part of the bad ones. the government claims that they declared independence but did not develop the declaration because there was a credible threat of real violence. And when I say real violence, I mean deadly violence. This was violence, but these were rubber bullets. I saw them. I saw the police shooting at people, rubber bullets. I had a rubber bullet on my hand. A guy lost his eye. This is horrible. I'm not trying to say this is okay, but this is rubber bullets, not metal bullets. There are no dead people here. So the threat of deadly violence is the reason that the Catalan government is giving for not developing the republic. Right? I think this is a mistake because this argument has no end. If you accept the consequences of the death of the threat of violence to operate, then what will you do? Because the presence of violence is there. So either in that moment you decided not to declare independence and tell the people this, look, there's a credible threat of deadly violence, let's call for an election, and if you want to pay the price of assuming this risk, then decide. And if not, then let's not do it. Or you go for it and you say, let's do like Lithuania. Let's put people doing peaceful resistance in front of institutions, and then let's see if that threat is really something that will become real. Now, in the case of Lithuania, the USSR sent the army and they killed 13 people. And after killing 13 people, they discovered that they had to kill 13,000 people in order to win. And they lost, or they decided to negotiate, right? So there's two options. Either you go for it, you declare independence, and you go for it with all you have, or you say, look, there's this problem here, let's discuss it democratically and decide if we want to pay this price or not. But what we have is the worst of two worlds. We have a declaration of independence that has consequences politically, but nothing to defend that declaration. It's just symbolic, and it leaves people unprotected. And that's what we're seeing these weeks. The sense of impunity that was created by the speech of the king has led to the emergence of neo-Nazis groups, and I'm not saying neo-Nazi to exaggerate, I'm saying people with Nazi flags, right? So neo-Nazis, literally neo-Nazis, proudly neo-Nazis, that are doing every other day demonstrations in towns in Catalonia and beating up people and attacking institutional buildings. There's a sense of impunity. This is happening, right? And I think this is the outcome of this declaration without backing or without democratic conversation. Now, the problems that the Catalan pro-independence movement faces are, I think, two. The folkloric trap. If you do symbolic things that don't translate into political realities, then you become the kind of people that is content with being right. And that's it. And then that energy translates into folklore, into forms of popular culture that have no roots politically. Now, the other temptation is violence. If you feel you're right, but there are no institutional translations to that, there's the temptation of becoming violent. Terrorism or low-level violence on the streets. These are two real possibilities that I think we should acknowledge if we're adults, and that is the consequence of this situation. Now, I think the only solution to these, two traps, at least on my end, is a sort of cultural response. And by this, I mean trying to put on the table, as part of the conversation, the real costs of wanting to be an independent country. Catalonia will be independent only unilaterally. We know this. In order for an agreed upon referendum, as far as Spanish institutions concern, implies a reform of the constitution, and that means 2/3 of the Spanish Congress. This will never happen in Spain. It will only happen if we overcome fear. And it will only happen if we risk violence as a response. Only these three things together will lead us to independence. And I don't think people acknowledge this, and I don't think they know this, not inside Catalonia or outside Catalonia in the international arena. And I think it's our job, and I say our, maybe it's just my job, but it's our job to put this kind of discourse on the table. Now, what we've learned is that in this process, is that Europe is a very dysfunctional institutional system that, however conservative it is, and that's understandable against processes of independence, their response to this is only cynical. Now, nobody expects the European Union to be in favor of a breakup of one of its member states, but the response has reached a level of cynicism that shows to what extent the institutions that are meant to be the democratic solution to the wars that have defined Europe for centuries, that response is only cynical and based on force and power. But we've learned something, I think, far more important for us that live in the United States. Recall that the Spanish Civil War between 36 and 39 is sometimes described as a stage or a rehearsal for the Second World War. What happened in Spain, to some extent, happened in the world after. Now, I think this is the case with what we saw in Catalonia. What we saw is a central power, in whatever form, institutional or not, defending itself against a popular movement. Now, that popular movement is possible because A, technologically it's possible to organize people without institutions, and B, contemporary people are less afraid of the exercise of power, at least in the West. Now, these two things together led to a movement that can be compared to, let me be a little, I'm proper here, the Black Lives Matter movement or the feminist movement in the West, or any other movement that has been suppressed in the past by the power of institutions and that now finds a new strength in the possibilities that technology offers, and education and so forth, right? So the response we're seeing is a response of repression, low-level repression. It's not military repression, it's police repression, but it is repression. And if European powers see, or Western powers see, that you can get away with this, then what will stop them? I think nothing. So shutting up websites, controlling media, stopping individuals from communicating, spying on individuals, and finally physically repressing them, this is the handbook of how to stop a movement that challenges the authority of a central power. I think that self-determination will be the topic of our time, and not only because it's my specialty, so I'm not asking for money here, but because the modern state, as we understand it, is the product of certain technological and institutional circumstances that happened late Renaissance, early modern period. The introduction of gunpowder, for example, in Western countries, allowed for the first time for central governments to control rebellious regions or cities. Recall that before gunpowder, to wage a war, you need horses. You needed horses. Horses need grass, right? And somebody to tend to them. And also you need special people to ride these horses. This is something it takes a long time to learn. So you need little kids living in castles, learning how to ride and how to fight. And then, this makes kings very weak, dependent upon feudal lords and so forth and so on. I'm simplifying, I know. The introduction of gunpowder makes this unnecessary. It's cheaper, you only need money, and it's very easy to learn how to shoot. Some months, maybe, not a lifetime. And you can tear down walls, as Machiavelli explains in The Prince, and you can control cities. And then the modern state can appear, can emerge or outcrop. You see this in The Prince and in other treatises of the time. Now, this is a period that began that moment, and I always say it ended in Auschwitz, which is that applied to the Industrial Revolution. We've lived 80 years or 50 years of, trying to redescribe our relationship with violence. And now we are in a moment in which this is no longer possible, this type of control. This type of control is possible, but not that type of control, that type of violence. So we're going to see more and more peoples silenced by history and gunpowder, so to speak, that will emerge and say, we want to partake in the worldly conversation. So keep this in mind. Pay attention to the Catalan crisis, because it's not only the Catalan crisis, it will be your crisis very soon. Thank you.
Whatever else we say, the sense of identity, meanwhile, the identity of the Catalonian people, sense of feeling for Catalonia, it has grown, right? The sense of nationalism among the Catalonians, the Catalan, has grown. And last weekend, I saw a demonstration on television, 750,000 people in Barcelona. It looked pretty serious to me.
Well,
does that mean growing a consolidation of the movement, or what?
Well, two things. First, that demonstration is not the biggest demonstration we've seen in these last years. We've seen 1.5 million people demonstrations, 2 million people demonstrations. In 2013, we see a 400-mile-long human chain. So, this is not new. And I know this is a very controversial statement, but I don't think Catalans are particularly nationalistic. I think they are people living in a very nationalistic state, and that they have, found an opportunity to defend themselves, but I don't think...
The sense of identity is very strong, right?
I think it's as strong as any other people in the world.
Oh.
Yeah? No. I think so, yeah.
We'll go back to that later.
Just a little background. I moved to Barcelona in 1981. Eventually I got a degree from the University of Autonomy de Barcelona in linguistics, and came here and did my doctorate, and went back because I had a connection now, and I married a Catalan who came here, but I've always been going back and forth. And we've heard a lot about language, and we've heard about cosmopolitanism, and I'm going to try to put those two things together. Now, when I said I married a Catalan, he's actually a member of the largest, what you could call, demographic group in Catalonia, which does not have a long history in Catalonia. That is, more than half the population traces their ancestry to another part of Spain, at least until the immigration began from outside of Spain, the international immigration around 2000. And this is, well, it still is the largest demographic group, if you want to divide things that way. Sociolinguistic research in Catalonia since about 1977, 1978, has dealt mainly with the integration of that population, that immigration. There was a very important work by a very well-known linguistic anthropologist, Kit Woolard, who did an experiment, a sort of sociolinguistic experiment, and discovered essentially that the Catalan language was very high in prestige. That was because it was associated with the more the upper social echelons of Catalonia, whereas Spanish had less prestige because it was more associated with the working classes. As in many other cases, the immigrants that came were mostly working class, although Catalans had always been of all social classes. So Catalan language had a lot of prestige, but there was also a huge ethno-linguistic division. When we say ethno-linguistic division, we mean a way of constructing ethnicity along language lines. And that the people who spoke Catalan people who identified it, what were called Catalan speakers, Catalano parlants, were bilingual because they had to be, but the Spanish speakers were monolingual. And when a Spanish speaker spoke in Catalan, this was not really that well received by either the Catalan speakers or especially by the other Spanish speakers. When the introduction of Catalan medium education happened with the transition, beginning soon after Franco's death and then becoming more institutionalized as time went on, everyone became at least passively bilingual. And Kid Willard returned to Catalonia around the end of the 1980s, and she repeated her experiment, and she found that this ethno-linguistic division had diminished extensively, so that people who spoke Catalan with a Spanish accent were no longer being poorly received. They were accepted. Another Catalan researcher, Catalan sociolinguistic researcher, Emili Bosch, proceeded to do an experiment, a very innovative experiment at the time, and found that people were also receiving well conversations in which each person started in their language and then switched to the other. Now, traditionally, Catalonia, or what typically happens in Catalonia, is that people will start speaking if the Catalan is non-native or they don't look Catalan, the interlocutor will then switch to Catalan. But he had people switching, not just, to speech to Spanish, people switching to Catalan, and this was also well received. It doesn't really happen very much, but it was not unaccepted. Later on, I went back, another generation went by, and I replicated, again, the first original experiment, somewhat different. And we now found a difference, another difference, was that not only were Catalan and Spanish sort of accepted equally, but that people whose way of speaking indicated that they were monolingual were kind of downgraded. They were not liked as much as people whose sounded as if they would be bilingual. And some subsequent research that we did convinced us that what was going on, this is me and Mireia Trengs Pereira, Catalan sociolinguist, that what's happening is that instead of this opposition between languages, we now found that the bilingualism itself, avoiding this conflict, this historical conflict between Spanish and Catalan, but saying that I'm not just someone who speaks Spanish, or I'm not someone who just speaks Catalan, had now morphed into I'm a bilingual person, and we attributed this to part of the cosmopolitan tendencies that we've seen growing throughout the 1990s and 2000s. So we have a case now where there was kind of a de-ethnicization of this traditional demographic split. You can have a Spanish last name and be a Catalanista. And that's always been the case, but it was always a little bit harder. Now it's nothing surprising about it. So what's happened is this diminishment, and this diminishment of particularism, which is a word that Kid Willard developed, has not just taken place in Catalonia. We've seen this marketing of Spain as a cosmopolitan country, in which Catalanism is painted as a parochial or a particularist construction. But within Catalonia, nobody ever would say that. Extreme Catalanism, where you say, no parlo castellano, I don't speak Spanish, because you refuse to, that might be seen as particularist. Or someone who refuses to speak Catalan, that's seen as Spanish only. That's seen as particularist, but not Catalanism itself as sort of a sense of what Catalonia is. Catalonia is a cosmopolitan country. If you look at some of the propaganda that independence activists have been putting out, it shows signs of this cosmopolitanism, of two young men sort of kissing or holding hands. All these sorts of signs of acceptance and tolerance, and it's part of a way of marketing independentism as something that is progressive. It's like what we want to see in what probably all of us as New Yorkers pride ourselves on, our cosmopolitanism. But what's I worry about now is, but this trend, I should say one thing. This is also one of the main parties promoting independence, the Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, has a platform in which they've said, we want our future Catalan Republic to be bilingual. It's not going to be just Catalan monolingual. It's going to be Spanish and Catalan because we are, we're not particulars. We're proud of our bilingualism or whatever reason. This has been controversial. There was a recent, before all this happened, issues happened, there was a reaction to that saying that we cannot have Spanish as a co-official language or of any tolerance. We have to have a monolingual Catalan state. The promoters of this, which is called the Manifest Koiné, referred to people who had come to Catalonia from other parts of Spain as involuntary colonizers, not as immigrants, as involuntary colonizers. And this is actually signed by descendants of some of those people. Interestingly, I want to say for my field, it was not a single sociolinguist that signed that. Some linguists signed it, but not a single sociolinguist. And they're all, Catalan sociolinguists are pro-independence. So that particular position is very much there, but it's probably still a minority position. That brings us to what happened now with this, starting with the initiation of the independence, current independence drive, which began with the cutting short of this Statute of Autonomy that my, how should I say, tocaya in Spanish, I don't know the word in Catalan for that, there's someone who shares the same name, it's a tocayo or tocaya, mentioned. That was the initiation of this entire process. And what we've seen in Spain, what we've seen in Catalonia, we've seen elsewhere in different forms. We've seen in the United States. We've seen this resurgence of particularism, of, in this case, Spanish nationalism, gaining power. And my fear is that this, besides the possibilities of whatever else is going on, is the rupture in Catalan society that is potential. The referendum, it should be said, got 90% of the vote, but most of the people didn't vote. And most of the people didn't vote. We don't know how much didn't vote, how many didn't vote because of fear, how many didn't vote because they weren't interested, and how many didn't vote because that was their way of expressing opposition to the idea of independence. There was never a majority, a clear majority for independence. There is no such thing as a consensus in Catalonia, either for or against independence. And even by models of independence, we don't know. I know people in my family that say, if we could just have what the Basques have, I wouldn't be for independence. The Basques in terms of a particular autonomous financial autonomy. But to what extent are we going to see, not just in Catalonia, not just in the US, but in the US and in Catalonia, this resurgence of particularism and this return to a kind of this backlash, which this ugliness we see in this image here, and we'll hopefully not see too much more of. I'm hopeful, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
This event has been organized not only by the Gilman Center, but also by Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at Queens College. And then you present that here. You can use that microphone if you wish. Maybe this is not on. Yeah, it is on. And also for the Foundation for Iberian Music. And also for the Farragut Fund, which is Marianne. We thank you all, and we again will go back to many of these issues.
The other day, Ana Gabriel said, the leader of the coup in the Catalan parliament, said that she was an independentist without borders, which is she was ridiculed, heavily ridiculed, because no, it's a contradiction. I don't think so. It's not a contradiction. It looks like one, but it's more like a metaphor complicated with paradox. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to say that she was an independentist without border, which is, I think, what I am. I mean, I am totally, and this is the only two things I want to say about me, besides saying that I am peripheral like him from Valencia and Charnego like those that he described, because charnegos is the way that they refer to as immigrants.
Well, that's an insulting term, though.
It is an insulting, and I have heard it. So, but I am totally for the right of self-determination, and taken to extremes. That's why I subscribe Ana Gabriel's word. Having said that, I need to say the second thing that I think is undeniable to me, which is that the PP is completely responsible for this situation since 2004, at least. Is a party that has provoked this knowingly. It's a party that you know already about the immense, massive economic corruption that has led and is still living with. But also is more important in this case, the corruption of the democracy channels and the corruption of the judiciary, which is extremely grave in this situation. But the economic situation, the economic corruption is also important because part of this was designed as a cover-up for that, was designed, made for, as a cover-up. Since then, they have fomented anti-Catalanism in many subtle and not subtle ways, and causing destruction of the society as we knew it. And I think the consequences are not foreseeable right now. We'll see. But what I would like to know more than those certainties is the uncertainties. I would like to problematize what is not so clear to me, because the value of a few words. After all, I'm sorry about talking about me again, I work with words. I am sorry to disappoint you, I'm not a political scientist or a politician or anything like that. I just study words, I study rhetorics. Rhetorics were invented precisely to use words as a tool, to use words in politics, as all of you know, back from Greece, and a tool for manipulating words, we would say. Is that a bullet rubber? To manipulate words, and of course, studying rhetoric is a good way to read through the manipulation of words. When I say words, of course, we can take the word extensively and talk about information, talk about the media, how to manipulate information, and one crucial piece of information is history, of course, that wonderful literary genre that is useful, so useful in so many instances. Now let's go back to basics for a while. Words, individual words. Independence, self-determination, democracy, voting, freedom, patriotism, unity, legal. All those are words that have a heavy positive charge. So we are all ready to accept them. They are powerful, and they're even more powerful when they are pounded every day on TV, on the media, and on everything that you read on people's ears. Repetition, by the way, is the most, recognized by studious people, is the most basic rhetorical tool. You can repeat one thing, and here in this country, you repeat a lie sufficient number of times, it becomes true, right? So yes, repetition is extremely powerful. It moves feelings, and that's very important because feelings move actions and voting or words or whatever. You need to move people, and you need to move people with words and with information. Let's take one word, independence. Such a wonderful word. It was so wonderful that in Spain we used to have a national independence day, May the 2nd, the day that Spain bravely rejected the French invasion, and Madrid still celebrates that as their holiday. May the 2nd is a holiday in Madrid, still now nowhere else. There used to be a whole country. Yes, Spain was free from the French invader and invasion, and of course, what we did, or what they did, I'm sorry, I wouldn't do that. We wouldn't have done that. They opened the doors to Ferdinand VII, such a wonderful king, was a corrupt, infamous tyrant that I always really seriously, since my childhood, I always thought that we would have been better off losing that battle and have been ruled by Napoleon's brother. After all, Napoleon had a wonderful plan, which is unifying Europe with one rule, which is what we have now, by the way. Anyway, so, but in a different way. Well, Ferdinand VII was not a wonderful person. He was the most disastrous king of Spain, and Spain lost a lot of decades in progression by winning that war. Freedom, another word. Freedom is a wonderful word, and I think particularly colonial countries have been, formerly colonies have been better off by getting free of their colonizers who were exploiting them and basically using their revenues to enrich and to build palaces in the metropolis, in London or in Madrid, rather than in their places, rather than hospitals in their places, right? Yes. The word freedom is heavily used every time a country gets free. Every country breaks from the colonization system that they are suffering for decades or for centuries in some cases. I remember studying this when I was doing the edition of Las Casas, particularly in America. When all the Latin American countries got free in the 19th century, Las Casas was promoted very heavily as a way of showing the people, the Indians that were there, look what the Spaniards did to you. Well, what the Spaniards did to you, the ones that were printing those books were the grandchildren of the Spaniards. Those who were supposed to pushed towards the front lines and dying for the independence of Mexico and Bolivia, Colombia, were the poor Indians that had been exploited since the 16th century, were exploited, and guess what? Were still exploited after that, after the independence, because the independence was a luxury toy for this elite that wanted to break free from the metropolis. And it was probably a good thing, but it was not a good thing for those who died in the front lines to make their patrons free and to make their taxis stay in Bogota, for example, and not traveling to Madrid. I don't think much of a difference happened to them. The money is spent in Miami now and not in their well-being. Another word, unity. Unity is a wonderful word that is used a lot, right? As opposed to break. For some reason, breaking is a bad word and unity is a good word, even though everybody knows that some people are better off separated than together. But I remember one minister, a formerly minister of the central government in Madrid, who said that if Catalonia got separated, it would be like, I would feel like losing an arm. I mean, this was a person with a university degree, and the ridiculous sentence was never contested by anybody. I mean, in its ridiculousness. But that sentence is powerful, and it's still very popular. That kind of thinking is very popular around. I have seen just last week somebody crying on TV because I want to break my country. What breaking your country means? Well, how that affects your living room and your life, I still don't understand. But I can think that it's linked. Somehow those attitudes are linked to the concept of essential. Spain is an essential thing. It's not a word that is used very much in the political discourse, but the concept is there. Somehow Spain is considered an essential unity whose integrity cannot be touched. Otherwise, it would be a total catastrophe. Spain has to be one, great and free, una grande libre, as the motto in the Franco-Day says. Of course, the greatness, well, the freedom, we have seen it already from the French, the kind of results, and the unity, we don't need to mention it. And the greatness refers to the conquest and the accomplishments in all sorts of things. It seems that Catalonia is also sold as something essentially something, with a number of quality to its inhabitants. It's a place or a community that is civilized, is progressive, is rich, all of which is kind of true to me, at least that's how I see it, is more civilized than other places, is richer than other places, and is certainly more progressive than other places. Problem is that I don't think it is essentially so, which is an important difference. Somehow, all those qualities are sold as permanent in Catalonia, unchangeable throughout history. From Gothic to modernism, this is so great. Nothing happened between Gothic and modernism, by the way. The Baroque never happened because that is the horrible period. Somehow the essential characters, as I said, is untouchable, and including, of course, very prominently, self-government, which is true, and Marianne has already illustrated us about that. I mean, the Catalan self-government did happen until 1715. Well, 14 was the military defeat. 1715 was the Nueva Planta, or the new rules. But it didn't happen. It's something that is manipulated from Spain as something that never happened and is a modern invention. Well, it's something that started in 1931 in the Republic. It's not true. I mean, it did happen. It happened for centuries, and it was interrupted in 1715, as I said. But another myth or another part of this essential Catalonia is that, in a way, it was a place that could have lived better by itself throughout history, because of those qualities that I just mentioned. Well, not quite. Catalonia was not always rich. There was a moment when it was quite poor, and in fact, probably the development of Catalonia as a modern economic power is an ironic byproduct of its poverty, because some people became more laborious and more entrepreneur and all that. And we have to remember when Olivares tried to unify Spain in the 17th century, unified from the institutional point of view, and tried to create an army, the one unified army. Castile was supposed to contribute 44,000 troops, and Catalonia only 16,000. Why? So it was much less. When I say Castile, I don't mean the rest of Spain. I mean the kingdom of Castile, without Mallorca, without Valencia, without Aragon, and all the other autonomous kingdoms. That gives an idea of how different were things back in the 17th century. Well, it didn't happen anyhow because of a number of problems. But as I said, I think it's a byproduct, it's an ironic byproduct of its poverty. Also, another ironic byproduct of what happened in the 18th century is that Catalonia entered formally the crown of Spain, as I said, in 1715. And that's why only from 1778 Catalans were allowed to trade and to do businesses in the so-called Spanish Empire, which was never a Spanish Empire before, because there was never Spain, for that matter. There was Castilian Empire. Catalans could not trade in there. There are some news about Catalans in the Caribbean already in the 16th century, but very, very, very few. The thing happened only at the very end of the 18th century. Of course, what else happened? Well, the Haitian Revolution, which disrupted and ended the sugar trade as we knew it, and Cuba entered the map of the sugar production at the same time that the Catalans are there for the first time allowed to trade there. The Castilian nobility and business people were too busy and too used to trade in a different way in the rest of the empire, so it was a perfect match. Catalans entered Cuba and became immensely rich by controlling the sugar production, the sugar trade. And of course, controlling the sugar market means controlling the slave market, because we are talking about exclusively slave-based economy, and that is the origin of the immense richness. So much for progressiveness, for permanent progressiveness from Catalan. Yes, this is what is behind the modernism. This is what is behind Gaudí, who paid for that, the sweat and tears of a lot of people. Democracy is another wonderful word. Voting and referendum is a word that I would apply to every single decision that the community has to make. When Rajoy in 2003, and he was in the opposition, demanded a referendum from the prime minister back then. Why? Well, it's an electoral trick, of course. Really, you can type in YouTube Rajoy Catalan referendum, and you will see he, in very, very, very strong words, demanding a referendum in Catalonia. If they want a referendum, you have to give a referendum so that you will be a Democrat, using these heavy words, referendum, democracy, voting, all that, their decision on all that. Of course, there is a trick to that. First of all, he knew he was not going to be convoked or approved. Second, he knew that back then independence was at 11%, so he knew that it would be a referendum that the Catalan independentists would lose. And third, he also wanted, the proposal, he didn't mention that in Congress, the proposal was to have a referendum where all of Spain would vote for the Catalan independence, which is a very cool concept and kind of peculiar, because it's a peculiar way of approaching the situation. It's like asking somebody, a couple that doesn't get along, if you want to divorce, both parts need to divorce, and both parts need to agree, not to the terms of the divorce, but to the divorce itself. So I think it's very peculiar. But from the other side, they claim that the independence is wanted by under 40% and therefore is legitimate, and the electoral census is sufficient. 40% of the electoral census is sufficient to declare the breakout of the country, and not thinking, well, not really thinking, but not saying that if that were the case, and this Catalan Republic of the future, the unionist parties were able to survive, and we hope that they will be able to survive, like everybody will be able to survive in this future republic, those people could organize, campaign, win elections in year 2024, let's say, and then unite again with Spain, and starting a cycle of every 4 years uniting and disunited, a connection and disconnection. How come? I mean, how does it work? Everybody should have the right to do, right? I mean, to concur to elections and have that. Well, now, somebody had mentioned the wider consensus. I also agree that everybody with some sort of saying will agree that you need more than half plus one in order to do something so serious and so irreversible, because it is irreversible as independence. But no, half plus one is democracy, the rest is tyranny, and the weight of those words is heavy and blur the reality of any situation. Reality, responsibility, they basically vanished in thin air. And talking about reality, there is a famous rejection from Europe in the last few weeks, and businesses leaving Catalonia, of course, encouraged by the central government, which has been express approving laws so that can happen overnight and not waiting. I mean, it has been really dirty game from their part.
Say un minuto.
Un minuto. Okay, my question is that really a surprise? Did the Catalan leaders didn't know that Europe would never approve such a thing as a Catalan independence, knowing that there are 30 other independentist possibilities in Europe, and they don't want to deal with that? Of course they knew. So who were they? What are they selling? What were they selling? Something that they didn't have. That was, I think, very irresponsible. They were the big brothers. They were acting like big brothers. We know better. You just vote, and we know better what to do the day after. Well, we saw that they didn't know what they were doing the day after. They had no idea and no clue of what to do the day after, which is very, 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 very sad, because by then, the damage has been done already. It would have been great, and I say, independence is without borders, but it would have been great if they really had a plan, and now it shows that they didn't have a plan. So why, in the first place, took the people to the streets? But let me talk a little bit about people in the streets. No? Yeah, well, talking about Rajoy is defending referendum, now it is famous, and you can see it in YouTube and in all the plays. The Catalan president, Puigdemont, was famously caught off guard by a journalist in TV, about the referendum in Kurdistan. And he didn't remember, he said he didn't remember what he had voted. 2 years ago, there was a motion in the Catalan parliament to simply support a referendum in Kurdistan, in the Sahara, in Western Sahara, in Africa, and in Palestine. And he said, oh yeah, I probably voted yes, because I am for self-determination and so forth. Well, no, he did vote no. He voted against. Of course, because back then and now they didn't want to upset Israel, Morocco, and Turkey. And of course, politics is more powerful than their belief in self-determination or war. But where did that war go after this? I don't know. In 2010, a motion was introduced in the Madrid Parliament because the Catalan parties have representation in Madrid Parliament. That motion was about repressing street activity, excessive street activity, and resulted in what is called now the gag law, ley mordaza. In Spain now it's forbidden to film police activities in the street, it's forbidden to convoke demonstrations via Twitter or any way, it's forbidden to demonstrate in front of the parliament or official buildings. It is forbidden. Yes, the interesting part about that is, well, the Catalan parties contested that law in court, challenged that law in court. But we need to remember that they introduced the motion in the first place. The problem is that the Spanish government got out of hand and went too far in writing that.
Gracias, José. Muchas
It
gracias.
has been written by them. That is forgotten now. That is forgotten, and people are calling for, go to the streets to demonstrate, go to the streets. Who is forbidding going to the streets?
Aplauso. We are going to return to these themes later in other events. You know, we were going to start today's event with something that came up in a conversation with Antoni, which was the Casals speech at the UN in 1977, Pablo Casals. Most of you know that speech, symbolic, emblematic of Catalonian or Catalan nationalism sentiment. We're going to go back to the Pablo Casals at some point. We did not do it tonight, we'll do it at some other time. We're asking our professor de música to set up a concert on Pablo Casals' music. Shall we pressure him to do that?
not?
He deserves.
If there is an audience.
You're what?
You will be very upset if we say Paulo instead of Paulo.
You support that, good. If you have other ideas about musicians and program, what should content be, please let us know. It's a wonderful introduction to these themes that you taught me into that song, El Canto de las Aves.
Al canto dels ocells.
Como es en español que puedo ver?
Al canto dels ocells. I think this issue, Pau Casals' issue and his relationship to Catalan nationalism and desire for independence is very important. Catalan musicians have been at times very pro-Spain and at times very pro-independence. Pau Casals was very pro-independence. Robert Gerard, another great composer, was very pro-independence. But before we had a generation, Enric Granados, Isaac Albéniz, and they were pan-Hispanic. So maybe we could explore that too.
Well,
I mean, the nuances, that's what I said
Well,
earlier.
Casals was also a great artist, and I think he deserves a look.
Absolutely.
Up to him, right? No, should we do that?
Definitely.
Yeah, well, send us your comments. You know, we don't have time to go into a lot of, this is your turn now, questions and comments. I wish we had had more time to, and we will do in the future, to address issues about the Spanish democracy. How do we assess this process that opened in the 70s? Is it failing? Is it succeeding? What are the prospects? And also return, of course, to the question of Catalonia and its own feelings of autonomy, which again, no matter all the comments we can have one way or the other, go back a long time and we'll be there for a long time. And we will be watching them, and hopefully you'll help, we will all work together in that effort. So right now, we have time for questions and comments from you. Please make them short.
I'd like to thank you for this roundtable. It's been truly heartwarming and emotional to hear some of the testimonies. You've mentioned the President Tarradellas, the coup d'etat of Tejero, Spain's vocation as a nation of nations, those scenes where children were singing songs the day of the voting, the Son Jean de Pau.
If I can get to the point, please.
The point would be maybe, and I would take issue with the fact that there was nobody in this roundtable on the other side of the aisle. If there had been, maybe we would have heard a different point of view. So, for example, if we had spoken about Tarradellas, we would have heard that Tarradellas wrote a very warning article against nationalism. He wasn't against Catalanism, but he was against nationalism. If we would have had somebody else on the table, maybe they would have thought that the coup d'etat de Tejero is comparable to the coup d'etat that we saw on October 1st, which was the true coup d'etat. Maybe. Well, the point is,
Your main point, and then
we've heard a very skewed point of view. And this is clearly the sort of intellectual gunpowder that has provoked many people to think differently in a bad way. But one last thing, and I would agree that the narrative, and I believe it was Jordi Graupera who said, there's no narrative on the side of Spain or the Union. And I agree. Spain has not been good at proving or showing a narrative, which is why the independent movement had only 10% support 5 years ago and nearly 40% support today. What that means, actually, is that 60% are not in favor of independence. And another thing that I've heard from Mr. Newman, and I think is what best sums it up, I'll finish on this note, is that clearly there is no consensus in Catalonia. There's simply no consensus. The nationalists have provoked a great rupture between one side and the other, and it's going to be a problem for all of us to rent it out. So
your comment helps bring out other comments. I think there's a view that is supported. Somebody else wants to raise your hand up. Raise your hand up.
My name is Martínez. I'm over 30 years living here. I don't speak Catalan. I speak English and Spanish. I don't have to express my opinion politically because I'm not Catalan. But my question is, how do you go? Whatever the Catalans decide is going to be in Catalonia, because I'm not going to be able to vote because I don't vote, I don't live there. However, what is the future of the Spanish language in Catalonia if the independence language wins?
My grandfather was, I am a Cuban American of Catalonian descent.
So, yo también. Mucho gusto.
My grandfather went to Cuba in 1903. He was not part of the colonial period. And he became a friend of Maciá in 1928. And actually, my grandfather participated in the creation of the Escalada. I have a picture with him, with Maciá, in 1928. But anyway, the point that I want to make, I have been going to Spain since I was 9 years old. Because in Cuba...
So, question please, with time.
Yeah. So I lived there in 1949, okay? And I went to school there in Barcelona to the Escolapios. And at that time, I remember you couldn't speak Catalan in the school. It was only Spanish. Then I went back to Spain when I left Cuba as a refugee. Spain gave me the visa, and we left Cuba because we lost everything that we had there. And that was in the 60s, and I lived in the situation of Franco. I remember that in Catalonia, the civil guards, the Guardia Civil, none of them was a Catalan. They were all from outside. Yeah. So, the division is there because, let's face it, after the Civil War, the Franco regime brought in 1 million people from the south to dilute the population.
Right. That's a comment. The entire issue of the Catalonians and Catalans in the diaspora is a very exciting one throughout Catalonian history.
Well, actually,
and we'll go back to, but not tonight. We'll do that some other time. Actually, Cuba and Puerto Rico were in 1928. Cuba, Puerto Rico had huge migrations played a big role in what was happening back home, and so did Argentina. Those three countries but that I would have to say for another occasion.
Well, the question of language was the one that I discussed, and the first thing I just want to say that there is no, the parties that have been most promoting independence have been promoting also a bilingual state. No one's been.
Sorry.
There's been only small groups that are proposing monolingual Catalan. The other questions
Very good.
more speech is the question.
You had some of your hand up before.
Well, Ignacio isn't here anymore, but I think I wanted. Ivan, I'm sorry, Ivan Espinosa, right? I don't think, first of all, the movement in Catalonia is so transversal that I don't think it can be ascribed only to nationalism. But I do have friends, I have very, very dear friends in Catalonia who come to New York and sit in my living room and complain about how they can't speak. And these are people who are influential people in their own right. And I say to them, what do you mean you can't speak? Why have you not taken the responsibility to establish a discourse of a pro-Catalan, a pro-union discourse that actually would once again talk about the plurinationalism in the Spanish state? And they have not. My friends who would like to remain in the Spanish Union have abdicated their responsibility. And the way Europe is abdicating its responsibility to respond to the desires of the regions and the cities who are not comfortable within the structure.
Okay, very good. Any other reactions? No. Jordi, comentario breve, muy breve.
Well,
Micrófono.
Well, the
Mike needs microphone. We were telling him.
I just want to clarify something. I'm no fan of Puigdemont, but that interview you mentioned in which it was discovered that he voted against the Kurd referendum. Just let's clarify the issue because I think it's important. This was a motion introduced in the parliament by the leftist party that was against the referendum in Catalonia, and Puigdemont's party offered an amendment to that text saying, yes, the referendum in Kurdistan and the right to self-determination of all peoples. And then they rejected that amendment, and then Puigdemont's party decided to vote against that thing because they saw it as a trap to say one thing and not the other. Again, I'm no fan of Puigdemont.
He didn't remember that when he was interviewed?
Well, because as you know, in parliaments when they vote motions, these are not laws, these are motions, resolutions, just rhetorical speeches. There's the leader of the faction, which was not him, because it was before he was the leader of the party. And you're there, and they tell you vote yes, vote no, or abstention, and you vote, and it's not your issue, and you just vote.
He was just a dictator. Yeah.
I know, but it's
Okay,
just I think it's relevant.
Thank you. You know, just to whet our appetite for future sessions, we're going to go this way now. Havana hosted the first Catalonian Congress, I'm told, in 1928, discussing the issue of autonomy and independence. 1928 in Havana, and in the city of Santiago de Cuba in the Eastern Province.
I have a picture.
Oh, I'd love to see the book.
And my grandfather is here, and my dad is here.
Your grandfather is there. Let's talk some more. No, we're going to go back. We're going to go back to this side of the room now, and then we'll go back to that side. Una y una. Yes, tell us who you are, please.
My name is Carol Lang, and I used to go to school here, but I have a question and a short comment. One of them is, I have a friend that lives in Galicia, and whenever we have a conversation about Catalan independence, she gets out, incredibly hysterical. So my question is, I said to her, in all the American press, and everybody, mentioned the fact that at least 900 people ended up going to the hospital during the October 1st referendum. She said to me 2 people went, and I knew that what she was giving me was fake news, but I wanted to find out for sure. But my position, I'm an internationalist, I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist. I don't see.
You are?
Yes. I don't see any solution And I have not heard, I've only heard on the other side how complicated the situation is. I don't see any solution in Catalan independence. I haven't heard an argument for it. And for me, to promote Catalan independence really just promotes Catalan capitalism, as opposed to the unity of the working class in Spain. There is no solution to this problem in Spain. There's no solution to the problem in Eastern Europe. Internationalism is the only solution. To pull Catalan apart, away from Spain, really reduces the power of the working class, and I have not heard an argument in support of it yet.
We're in a democracy, you can say whatever you want to say within the.
I came to the United States. I'm from Spain, from southern Spain. I'm a physician. And I just want to address a question.
Question, please.
Yes. In 1978, the official representatives of every autonomy in Spain signed the Constitution. Every country that is a democracy, Spain, the United States, they do have a constitution. If one state here in the United States says that wants to become independent, let's say Manhattan, okay?
I would say go for it.
How do you go about that? How would the rest of the country allow that? I mean, I believe that Catalonia has the right to express their wishes, but the Catalonians representative signed the constitution, and that's something every country respects very much. Okay? The other thing is that with regard to the language, and I appreciate your remarks with respect to the bilingualism and all that. In, I think it was in 2014, Catalonia proposed preferential treatment to Catalan, that the Catalonian language would be preferential to Spanish. So that was completely taken out of the list when they requested all that. But I do see that there's a room for coexistence of both languages. And I have heard remarks and complaints that if you go to Catalonia, you would not learn Spanish over there.
Never.
Okay? So that's really, it hurts me. I am a Spaniard. I love Catalonia, and I love Mallorca too. I can make you a good tumbet.
One follow-up question, part of that. What are the grievances of Catalonia? What are the grievances for any of you?
The Constitution is made, the people are made part of the Constitution, and in order to respect the Constitution, the Constitution is made to serve the people. I mean, if a constitution gets too old, you have to change it. I mean, it's absurd, well, the situation we have in this country. Oh, the constitution is so sacred that has hundreds of years, and we are bound to live by the rules that the founder fathers of the country live and decided ages ago when the situation, the social situation was completely different. Well, you can transport that to Spain. Why are we bound to the constitution? Yeah, we can change that. And then secondly, let's break this adoration to the legal concept. I mean, this country wouldn't be free, wouldn't be a country if legality has been respected. It was a colony. Of course, they had to break the rules in order to be free. So I don't see the problem with legality or the constitution or anything like that.
Right.
Things change with time, I think.
Michael, you want to comment?
Yeah. The situation with the languages, is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, it
The
is.
situation with the languages is there's a lot of mythology about the situation of Spanish in Catalonia, and the idea of preferential treatment of Catalan is a compensation for the dominance of Spanish in every other sphere. So even with the preferential treatment of Catalan, it's a form of, it's going to be an inadequate form of, how should I say, it's an inadequate form to impose a monolingualism. What it is trying to do is safeguard a certain area of, a certain conceptual space for Catalan, which is within the administration and above all within the school system. The school system, I also want to add, even though you didn't ask, is not a Catalan medium, purely Catalan medium school system. It's a bilingual system with a preference for Catalan. So there's a lot of myths about it, about what happens in the schools. And one of the myths is that Spanish is treated like a foreign language. It's absolutely not treated like a foreign language. It's a
Good,
taught like a native language. I'm done.
Jordi, you want to comment?
No, I just want to say that I was raised in that school system. I was born in 1981 after the coup d'etat, because I wanted to be sure. And so I was raised under those laws. And I don't know if that serves as proof of anything, but when I was in college, I won the debate competition in Spain in Spanish. So, my Spanish must not be that bad. One said this, let me answer your question. It would be a very long conversation to answer what you said, but let me tell you something. You're proof that you don't need to be from the same country to be solidary with other working class people.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marlene Gottlieb. I'm professor from the Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian program. My question is, one of you mentioned that if Catalonia had the same privileges that the Basque autonomy had, that perhaps would be sufficient. What does the Basque autonomy have in terms of its freedom or its autonomous freedom that the Catalonians do not have?
We take three questions. And then we reply to all. Yeah, Alfonso.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz, and actually my first name is Jorge. So to ingratiate with you, I will call myself Jordi. But that's as far as I would ingratiate, because I think the issue is that you guys, both the Catalonians and of course the Castilians, are going the South American or the Latin American way. That's all I want to say. I mean, you think
I hope you say that as a compliment.
No, that's what I said. That's what I said. As far as I wanted to compliment you, I could be Jordi as well. In fact, but you guys are like the Barça and the Real Madrid. Just.
Gracias, Jordi, gracias. We have somebody here, and then we go to the whole.
I had a quick question for Jordi. I'm Mar, I'm a Catalan.
I'm sorry.
It's a question for you. You were talking about the future of the pro-independence movement, and you mentioned at one point that without violence, maybe we cannot achieve independence. So that's the thing that worries me a little bit, because I think the movement has been characterized for being peaceful. And we are not strong with the violence, and I think we don't want to go that way. So what is the future, imagining now that the pro-independence parties, that there are fair elections, they win the 21st of December elections, how do you see the future of pro-independence?
Okay, we have three questions, some comments, succinct, and then we'll take another round.
Let me ask this question because it's very important. I think I didn't express myself well. I didn't mean that we need to exercise violence. I meant we need to risk the possibility that the Spanish state responds with violence. So the argument for not developing the republic was there might be violence. I'm saying the only way we're going to become independent is if we risk that possibility as something actual. I'm not saying we should be violent. I think our only way is peaceful resistance.
If we win the elections, the pro-independence elections, what should they do?
Well, it's a good question. Sorry, just the Basque question. Basques have three characteristics. One, they are far less than Catalans.
Yeah, fewer.
Fewer than people in Catalan. So that means that their weight in the Spanish economy is also less than the Catalan. Second, they have financial autonomy, which means that they collect all the taxes, and then they pay to the Spanish state whatever services the Spanish state.
And is that something Catalonia would like?
I don't know. Some people might,
and some people might not. That's
people that I spoke to, like that. That's a lot of people say
that. One of the main grievances.
There's never been a vote.
And it's not clear. I mean, I think the notions are insistence on always seeing things in economic terms, I think, is also a blind spot. Certainly, if there had been a fiscal pact 10 years ago, maybe we might not have reached this point. But it is cultural. I mean, I think that cultural and linguistic rights are human rights, and this is one of the issues in Catalonia. People are and there is a transversality also that goes from the radical left to the moderate right, because the non-moderate right tends to be pro-union. So, you know, I think that if you look at the map, the electoral map in Catalonia, you'll also see a tremendous solidarity on a great part of it with. And the other thing is, I think if Catalonia were to achieve independence, it would not suddenly not have relationships with Spain or with the rest of the world. It will be there. It's not breaking off physically. So, you know, what it will have is the ability to reach agreements with Spain, reach agreements with France, reach agreements with Italy, and have its own autonomy.
Catalonia has 7 million people?
7.5.
7.5. The economy is how big?
19.4% of Spanish GDP, 230,000 million euros of GDP, third port of the Mediterranean, a little bit above average in personal income.
20% of the economy.
20% of Spanish
Fiscal contribution to the federal government, to the central?
24%.
24%, so there's a gap there.
Yeah, well, the numbers are 16% of the population, 19.4% of the GDP, 24% of the total budget, 11% of public investment. I think that's it. That's it.
That's it, exactly.
That's not bad.
And Messi doesn't pay taxes.
No, I mean.
So we'll take another round of 3 questions, and I think we may have.
So there's a fiscal imbalance between Catalonia and the central state that amounts to an average of 8.3% of Catalan GDP. So every year, 8.3% of Catalan GDP goes to federal taxes that never returns. Now, this has been a topic for a lot of time, but my personal view, I'm not keen to stress that, but my personal view is that of course there must be a limit to interregional solidarity, we know this, but I think this is just an expression of the overall discrimination. This can happen because there are other forms of discrimination that allow for this to happen. I don't think this is the problem. I think this is a symptom of the problem.
Very good. Another round of questions. To the point, please.
I'm Professor Alonso from Brooklyn College. I have a couple of questions for the political side of the table. The first question has to do at the day after. No? After the underestimation of the strength of the Spanish state, there was a very clear problem in the way you approach independence and October 1st, because very clearly the political leaders have no political reading of the conjuncture in Gramscian terms, and because of that, they didn't have a strategy, an effective strategy to confront the power of the state. Is there any plan right now? Because my perception is that there is a very clear misreading of the structure of the Spanish state that has been there for 500 years and incorporates, as we have seen here today, a lot of fascist elements that you have somehow missing in your analysis.
So question, please.
Second question has to do, at the same time, the Catalan has to have a kind of accountability for the role that the Catalan parties play in the Spanish democracy, 1993, 1996, 2004, 2008. And no disagreements between the Spanish government and the Catalan government. Besides the fiscal agreement, there was no real policy regarding 155, regarding constitution, regarding the real key points that have constructed this failed state that is actually Spain. So on the one hand, is there a strategy after the real disaster of the political strategy October 1st to really confront the structures of the state? Is there any possible alliance with other political parties in Spain that may be supporting together also at the definition of the structure, or there is nothing? It seems that political and legal part is very weak in the whole part. Second, accountability.
No, that's the third.
Responsibility in the way this state has been designed, depending on the role that the Catalan minorities played. 1993, that was very, very dangerous. 1993, under the government, 1996, 2004, 2008, etc.
Gracias. Okay, this is the last round of questions, or comments.
Okay, well, my name is Gemma, and I'm Catalan, and this question is most likely for Jordi. because he said that we're talking about European Union and everything. So I think that all these grew from a Catalan civilian movement more than the government. So you think that that the Catalan civilian movement can become a European civilian movement? And if that's the case, because we see the response by Europe, and I see that people in the rest of Europe, like just civilians, they don't understand what's going on. So do you think that it can become a civilian movement, and what would be necessary for that to happen?
Yes. I'm Orlando Hernandez, and I just wanted to ask a question with regards to the relationship between the independence movement in Catalonia and the independence movement in other parts of Europe, particularly the Basque region and also in Scotland and other parts of Europe.
Very good. We have three sets of questions. Who wants you want to go first?
I think there are better people that are qualified to address.
I think your first question about the underestimation of the Spanish state, I think it's the logical question any reasonable person would ask in this, but I think it's wrong because you overestimate Catalan leaders. Meaning you think, and this is just my personal opinion, you think they want independence. You think these leaders want independence and they underestimate the force of the Spanish state as an opposition to that wish. Now, I've come to the realization that they never thought that the referendum of October 1st would go that well. They thought that they would be really repressed and that they would not be able to vote, and therefore they would complain a lot, and we're right, and they're wrong, and we're good, and they're bad, and then let's go for an election. I think that's what they had in mind. And it caught them as surprise that, so many people voted. And this allows me to answer something you said about, or you maybe. 38.5% of the census voted yes to independence, which means that in a regular referendum, for the no vote to tie with that, they need another 38.5% of the vote. And this together makes a 77% turnout. Has never happened in Catalonia. This has never happened in Catalonia. So, which means that the numbers are not that bad. Just answering the question. So they, and your second question, you're totally right. I think they are responsible for what Spain has become, and they're using the pro-independence movement as a scapegoat, not to be accountable for what they've done for ages in Catalan politics. So yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, I also like to. First of all, I agree totally with his first part. The second doesn't matter. I mean, we can play with numbers a lot, but certainly there is no sufficient consensus. But let's not talk about that now. And I think what you just said and you answered is perfectly correct. They don't have a plan. They never had a plan. And I'm glad you said that, because I think the movement is the fun in here. It's not the end. It's not the goal. The goal is to make as much noise as possible from both parts, by the way. Both big brothers are moving the masses to the street and moving things around just to hide their own inefficiencies. Yes. Just let's have fun and let's see where we are in 10 years from now.
Very good.
And electoral purposes and not making happy their people, which is what they all should do. This is not governing. This is just moving the fun.
I think we're doing a lot of speculation here. We don't know to what extent there was thought behind the way things worked out, whether there was incompetence. We don't know.
They didn't know Europe would say no way. That was so obvious. Come on. They didn't know you cannot proclaim independence with
many historical examples of people being incompetent and idiotic. So we don't need to achacar. I can't think of the word in English.
Attribute.
Attribute. Thank you. We needed a translator. We don't need to attribute foreknowledge.
Well, can I answer this for a second?
Shouldn't have been a leader.
I know a little. I know a little, not only because I've worked on this and I'm a journalist there and I publish there, but also because for a long time, Catalan politicians have asked for my advice and I've been in meetings with them, talking about this. And when it's very, he says, I'm happy that he said so. It hurts me to say this, but I've come to the realization that, they didn't have anything ready because 48 hours before the referendum, I was in a meeting in which everyone assumed that the referendum was going to happen. So,
thank you.
Okay, anything else?
I think I'm
That's it. Well, yeah, we have, you have questions. Very fast, please.
Yes, it's very quick. Well, thanks for the presentation. I have a really, really good question.
You want to come over to use the microphone?
You should know that we met on October 1st. Garam was in, the day before, was in Barcelona also for the referendum as an international visitor.
Yeah, I've been seeing how the base movement has been developed the last 5 years, and I would like to know, at the same time the Catalan for independence activism has been accelerated, I could also observe that the Spanish nationalism has been revived recently. And I would like to ask if there is any serious reflection from Spanish intellectual or Spanish left. That's my brief quick question.
The word intellectual is so downgraded right now.
I saw another hand out.
No, I'm serious.
Yes.
I know, but it's...
The other day was a first-rank intellectual saying
El anarquismo español. José.
My name is Barbara. I'm Catalan. I'm a professor at Bremen University, and I'm making right now a stage as a visiting scholar at Columbia. I would only like to make one little remark. You have been talking, or we have been talking about people being sent to the street and politicians calling people for demonstrating. Well, I also know the reality in Catalonia, and I can tell you, these calls are not the main problem or the main issue for going to the street. It's a base movement, and they were not counting on it. Yeah. It has become bigger than they thought. Yes. Artur Mas has never been an independentist. I am one, all my family, and in my living space, and I can tell you we have been for decades talking about this kind of politicians, like they don't really want to be independent. Okay, so I didn't. Sorry. So this is, which I think is the question which many people don't understand. This won't be over and passed by on the day after the 21st of December.
Yeah, whatever happens, we'll go on.
Still be there. Maybe they can change the politicians.
Any last comment? Question? Very there. Yeah, go ahead.
It's not over in Scotland either, right?
La última.
Wait, and then
yeah, I would like to ask if any of the speakers, I don't really mind, if anyone believes that we're falling into some sort of like double standard when talking about the state using force and watching these really despicable images. I would like to know the position of any of the other speakers regarding also the police brutality that was used in 2011 when Artur Mas, the previous president of the Generalitat, decided to dissolve some pro-left demonstrators from Plaza Catalunya. The images we saw were pretty similar to these ones. There was one difference, and in this case, the police was sent by a judge. In 2011, it was the Catalan government itself who sent the Mossos d'Esquadra, and also Barcelona sent the local police. So I'm just curious to hear opinions on that, because my fear is that either we are forgetting too soon, or we're falling into double standards.
Okay, I really want to answer this question. I really want to answer this question.
Okay. I mean, I want to answer her question.
Please.
they're together because I think
Go ahead, José, go ahead, answer.
mass mobilization in the street is absolutely great and is happening every day. And I think it's a good way, particularly when it's done that way. Now, it is interesting, and that was my comment, not another one, which is that it is interesting that when the demonstrations were against the Generalitat, which means the party that now is promoting that, when the Generalitat was in the hands of this party, they didn't think it twice in sending the police. Now they are called the Mossos Amorosos because they were so good in the October 1st thing. But they were destroying the tents and they were acting quite brutally in Plaza Catalunya. And the Generalitat started. One woman left. You remember in another demonstration, one woman also lost her eye because of the bullet. Not only this guy here.
That's what plastic bullets are.
So exactly, and then they use the same tricks that the central government is used, manipulating the juridical system in order to avoid the Mossos being sued and being challenged in court. And then when 11 Mossos Amorosos killed a guy by hitting him in the street in the Raval, and somebody was filming the whole thing from the balcony, their reaction was, first of all, those guys are again in the police force because the Generalitat makes sure that they were not sued and condemned in time, and second, you can no longer film the police in their action when they are in duty, which means the same thing. It's the same rubbish that is happening in Madrid in the way of manipulating the system, the democratic channels and the judicial channels.
Thank you, José.
So, yes, you answered the way her question to my...
Well, I want to say something first. For me, it's the same people, right? The people that were in Plaza Catalunya in 2011 and the people that went to vote, it's the same people, it's the same state violence, it's the same conflict that I was trying to describe between, powers and movements. So that, second, at that time, I interviewed the regional minister of Interior for that, and we had a very violent conversation in which I almost lost my job for that, conversation. So I don't have a double standard on that issue. But after that, after Esther Quintana lost her eye, the Catalan society entered into a process of reflection and democratic conversation that happened both in the social movements, on the streets, and in the parliament, that led to two things: to the change of the ethical code of the police and the way that anti-riot police, Catalan police, can operate in front of demonstrators, and second, the banning of certain weapons, including rubber bullets. So that has never happened again because the political sphere works. Now, even though those rubber bullets are forbidden in Catalonia, the Spanish police was sent there with rubber bullets. Now, the argument they're using is this ban only applies to the Catalan police because it's not a ban about the country because it doesn't exist. It's just about the competence on these police, right? So, yes, that was outrageous and that led to an awakening. The question is, will this lead to an awakening to the people that support the Spanish state? I don't think so.
We have a lot of questions, very exciting introduction. We'll go back to many of these issues and others. For now, we want to thank Jordi Graupera, we want to thank Newman, we want to thank Michael Newman, we want to thank Antoni Pizà, and we want to thank José Martínez Torrejón. Round of applause to them and to yourself.